Illinois cornerback Devon Witherspoon has that dog in him, but is that enough to make him a target for the Atlanta Falcons in the top 10 of the 2023 NFL Draft?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it's available. So, guys, today is a mock draft Monday where we look at a prospect that could potentially be on the Falcons' radar in round one. In today's episode, we'll be centering all about Devon Witherspoon, the Illinois corner, why he could be on the Falcons' radar, why I am not as high on Devon Witherspoon as maybe other people are, to sort of look at him as a Falcons prospect, and whether or not the Falcons are just in general going to be averse to the idea of taking a corner that high. So up front, I will sit here and tell you guys up front that I don't think Devon Witherspoon is going to be on the Falcons short list for corners, or players, draft picks at the top of round one. I could be definitely wrong about this, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why I'm skeptical of Witherspoon being on their radar, but let's talk about the reasons why he would be on their radar. And it really centers on that dog mentality, as they say. And usually when people say, this guy's got that dog in him, I usually hate that statement. And a lot of that stems from 2020 offseason, when a lot of people were of the mindset of like, oh, we're replacing Vic Beasley, who lacked the dog, with players that do have that dog, and Dante Fowler and Marlon Davidson. And it didn't quite work out. And to me, saying a player has that dog in him is a nothing statement. It's like, especially with those pass rushers, like can they rush the quarterback or not? I don't care about what dog they have. Do they have the technical know-how to be able to get pressure on the quarterback? And the answer for all three of those guys, regardless of what dog they had in them, was not really. Although I will say, the reason why Dante Fowler is making $3 million this year and Vic Beasley's playing the XFL probably has something to do with that dog mentality. But, I think that statement does fit with Devon Witherspoon quite a bit. Like, he plays a relentless style of football. Think of him like a pit bull, an unleashed pit bull, just kind of roaming around the football field. Whether it's playing against the run, he's constantly looking to get involved in run support, or in pass plays where even if it's not, the ball isn't going to his man, like he's tracking the ball in the air to be like, can I pick this pass off? And like, you can just see that mental process with him. He plays with a disregard for his body that most cornerbacks don't play with, because most cornerbacks know, like, if I'm going to lower my shoulder and try to hit this 215-pound running back, like, that may affect my ability to cover on the very next snap. And so they're making business decisions. Devon Witherspoon ain't about that business, boss, right? Like, his business is like, I'm going to hit people, and I'm going to talk trash, and I'm going to play with a certain swagger. And it just jumps out on the film. And so he is a very fun watch, and it's a reason why he is a lot of people's number one corner in this draft class. And it's not just simply, hey, he brings a certain mentality on the football field. The film also backs up a very good player, right? And especially if you look at like some of the PFF metrics and grades that came out this past year, it strongly hints that he's a very good player and one of the best in college football, where he was the highest graded cornerback in terms of coverage grade according to PFF this past year. Their charting only allowed 35% completion rate, a 25 passer rating, 0 touchdowns and 62 targets, had 3 interceptions, 14 pass breakups this past year. Illinois also plays the highest percentage of man coverage, according to PFF, in the nation this past year, with about 76% of their snaps being man coverage. And for those that don't know, a high degree of man coverage in the NFL is about 50, maybe 55% of your snaps, but normally in the NFL, you're playing like 30-35% man coverage, typically in the NFL. So that is an extraordinary amount by NFL standards. And yet he graded extremely high in man coverage according to PFF with a 90 coverage grade in man coverage. So that was like the fourth best of any corner in the country this past year. Only gave up 28% completion rate in man coverage, a 21.5 passer rating in man coverage. And it's not as if he's an elite man cover corner and can't handle himself in zone. He had a 90 coverage grade in zone, a 47 passer rating allowed there as well. So really, when you look at the kind of the selling point of Devon Witherspoon and why the Falcons would be attracted to him is that swagger, that energy that he's going to bring on defense, in addition to being a man cover corner that we're expecting to see the Falcons dial up their man coverage with Ryan Nielsen taking over as defensive coordinator, given that the Saints were one of the teams that were on the high end of man coverage over the last several years while he was the defensive line coach there. And of course, Dennis Allen was calling the defense there. And so I think really the selling point for Devon Witherspoon here in Atlanta is, going to the makeup of the football player, right? He has that makeup that I'm sure the Atlanta Falcons will absolutely fall in love with. And it's hard for any person who loves the game of football to not fall in love with Devon Witherspoon's makeup in terms of his love for the game of football. He exudes a very passionate and love for this football game. And I know for a lot of Falcon fans, that's music to their ears, because I know a lot of Falcon fans, I've talked to several of them over the last several months, that rather than Jesse Bates being the guy that they were hoping the Falcons would sign to upgrade that safety position, they were looking at a guy like CJ Gardner-Johnson, who ultimately signed with the Lions. But everybody who knows anything about CJ is, he's a little different, right? He's a borderline psychopath, in a lot of ways. And I think, I don't know if Devon Witherspoon is quite the same in terms of his psychopathic tendencies. All right. He hasn't getting multiple receivers swinging on him over the course of his NFL career like CJGJ has, but he has some similar psychopathic tendency just from the style of play. From a personality standpoint, he seems like a regular dude. I don't know if the same can be said about CJGJ, but like if that type of player is what you think this Falcons defense was missing, and again, talking to Falcon fans over the last several months in the lead up to free agency, several people voiced to me like, we need that type of a mentality and swagger on defense. Then Devon Witherspoon is definitely going to be right up your alley. So he's going to definitely be a potentially fun addition to the Falcons defense, a very promising number 2 corner across from AJ Terrell, and a player that many people have often compared Devon Witherspoon to is Jair Alexander, who of course the Falcons' new assistant head coach Jerry Gray helped coach in addition to Joe Witt Jr., former Falcons secondary coach in Green Bay, and developed there in Green Bay. So there's certainly an understandable appeal for this type of player if Devon Witherspoon looks a lot like Jair Alexander. So he's a fun watch. I'd probably say he's my favorite corner in this draft class, but I don't know if that necessarily translates to him being the best corner in the draft class. And we'll talk about why that is, because he's not typically the type of corner that typically goes as high as where the Falcons will be selecting with the 8th overall selection in the draft. And, I also think watching the film, I don't know if he has quite the skill set that I think is going to make him an outlier in that regard, that you're going to be willing to bet on him despite this concern about him not being an atypical top 10 pick. And we'll break all of that down as we continue and talk about why I'm not convinced that Witherspoon is going to be particularly high on the Falcons' radar at the top of the draft as we continue today's episode. Today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM. And you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game. And, as you guys, free agency kind of is winding down and we're gearing up towards the draft, but free agency never has to wind down for you if you play the Ultimate Football GM, because you can control every strategic aspect of your football team, from hiring coaches, coordinators, free agency, the draft, going through all the ups and downs of the season. It's a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free. It's playable offline, so you can play it on the go as you go whenever you want. That is something that is a strength of it, because I can put it down for a couple of days and pick it right back up and fall right back into it. I know I got a quarterback change on my Atlanta Falcons. I think we're now in the 2030s at this point in the game. So in the distant future, making some moves. But if you want to make similar moves, make sure you download the game by going to ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. And when you do, make sure you use the promo code locked on in all caps. That's LOCKEDON in all caps, and you'll get a 100% free boost to your franchise in the game store. So make sure you check it out at ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So let's talk about some of the downsides of Devon Witherspoon and a couple of disclaimers, I should say. Historically speaking, cornerback is a position I have the least amount of confidence in my evaluations. I don't think I'm bad at evaluating, but I've had some notable misses. I was too low on Desmond Trufant. I was too high on Jalen Collins and Isaiah Oliver. That same draft class, I had Mike Hughes as my top corner over guys like Jair Alexander and Denzel Ward. And, meanwhile, 5 years later, Denzel Ward and Jair Alexander are the two highest paid corners in the NFL. And Mike Hughes is joining the Atlanta Falcons, his fourth NFL team in 6 years. I've been a little bit better as of late because, I feel like I was in the ballpark on AJ Terrell and whatnot. But basically, if all about the next 10 minutes of this podcast ages very poorly in a couple of years, we'll understand. It's like, okay, Aaron's still working through some issues when it comes to cornerback evaluations. And the other disclaimer I'll say is we're going to talk about what is kind of typical of a top 10 corner. And I'm making an assumption that the Falcons will be drafting like a typical NFL team. And that is not necessarily a good assumption, but it's an assumption I'm going to make for the rest of today's episode. And this is important because Devon Witherspoon has a pro day later this week. I believe it's on Wednesday. And, I'm expecting him to test reasonably well, but I'm not expecting him to test great. So this may also age pretty poorly in a couple of days. So we'll potentially revisit this topic later in the week once we get some of those testing numbers from him at his personal pro day. But I think going back to something we've discussed a number of times on this podcast, Witherspoon is not your typical top 10 corner. And I think that's the biggest obstacle for the Falcons to take him at 8, right? I've gone back and looked at, combine data since 2010 of all the first round corners. And your typical top 10 corner on average is about 6'1.5", 199 pounds with 32.25-inch arms and runs a 4.4 140 time. And you look at Witherspoon, who hasn't yet to run his 40 due to hamstring issues that limited him at the combine and at his pro day earlier, which is why he'll have his own specific one later this week. But he measured 5'11 and a half, 181 pounds with 31.25-inch arms. Now, the thing that I've talked about previous on the podcast, and go back to the mock draft Monday that we did, I don't know, like 4 weeks ago with Christian Gonzalez, the Oregon corner, we talked about sort of cornerback is a height, weight, speed position when it comes to how high guys get drafted, right? That's what the strongest correlation to where you get drafted is based off of how tall you are and your weight adjusted 40 times. So it's basically height, weight, speed is going to lead to you guys, the corners getting drafted higher. And with Witherspoon being 181 pounds, there's only been one corner since 2010 that was drafted in the first round that was sub 185 pounds, and that was Denzel Ward, who was a top 5 pick back in 2018. And Ward was obviously a very good college corner at Ohio State, had a 5'11", 183-pound frame, 31.25-inch arms, which was 42nd percentile, same arm length as AJ Terrell's, a little bit bigger. But Ward ran a 4.32 40, which is 96th percentile among cornerbacks, according to mockdraftable.com. His broad jump of 136 inches was 98th percentile. So Ward was kind of this special athlete, despite the fact that he didn't look the part necessarily of your typical top 10 corner in terms of height and weight and whatnot. But he certainly had the speed when it came to that. And then you look at a player like Jair Alexander, who Witherspoon is often compared to, and Alexander was 5'10 and 196 at that year's combine. And that 15 pounds of muscle that Alexander's working with, that Witherspoon is not necessarily working with, I think is notable, right? That, 196 pounds versus a 181. Alexander also tested well, a 4.38 40, 89th percentile, 127-inch broad jump with his 80th percentile in his agility drills with a 6.71 second three cone and a 3.98 short shuttle. Both of those were 88th percentile according to mockdraftable.com. And so I kind of want to see Witherspoon kind of, if he's going to test, somewhere in the 75th percentile or above in order to merit him being a potential outlier in terms of being a high-end athlete. And so some of those numbers that we may be looking for on his pro day that would be 75th percentile or higher would be a 4.42 or faster, a 6.813 cone or faster, a 4.07 short shuttle or faster, and a 126-inch broad jump or a 10.6 broad jump. So those are kind of 75th percentile across the board for a cornerback. And I think you kind of want to see if Witherspoon's going to be this sort of Denzel Ward-esque outlier, you kind of need him to test at that level. Frankly, you could argue he needs to be tested even much better than 75th percentile in that regard. But, I'm not expecting him to test like an elite athlete in the 90th percentile. Maybe he can get to the 60th and 70th percentile. That's kind of what he looks like to me on film, right? Because I've watched some more film of Witherspoon recently. And one of the issues I had with him watching the film was he tended to get out of phase at times. And out of phase, for those of you not familiar with that term, I'm basically using that is basically when a receiver gets a step on you, right? Where you're out of phase for the cornerback in that regard. And one of the things I've tried to learn from my failed evaluations of past corners is trying to look and see if there's panic in a guy. Like, to me, you want to see a guy that has that, Jim Moore used to call it the athletic arrogance, that like basically like when he gets out of phase, there's no panic in him because he knows like, okay, I might be a step behind or a half step behind this guy, but I'm an athlete. I can keep pace with this guy. I'll be able to make up the ground. And I didn't necessarily see that with Witherspoon. There was too often sort of at the top of routes where receivers were able to get separation. Things tended to get a little bit more frenetic watching him on film, where it just felt like he was a little bit out of phase, a little bit more panicky in his movements that didn't suggest to me that he was a high-end athlete that we're talking about that he needs to be in order to solidify himself as a top 10 pick. Like, one game that stood out to me was Dontavian Wicks, the Virginia wide receiver, seemed to get the better of him a number of times. Now, it didn't result in a ton of production. Some of that is owed to the quarterback not being able to get the ball to the receiver due to pressure and other factors and whatnot. But it did seem like watching the film that, these lesser receivers, and Wicks is probably going to be a day 3 wide receiver, probably a 4th round pick based off of, some of the projections I've seen, and like, I'm not going to say he struggled against him, but like it'd be different if it was Christian Gonzalez versus Drake London, who was a top 10 pick. Right. And like, if we, one of the knocks on Gonzalez was like, Drake London gave him some problems. That's fine, because Drake London's Drake London. But like, we're talking about a 4th round receiver that's giving you problems. Like, I'm like, And it wasn't just the Virginia game. It was a couple of other games where I'm like, some of these receivers that are not going to be high end receivers are giving him a lot more fits than I think a potential top 10 corner should be getting. And one of the things that's notable about Witherspoon is he never played the Ohio State receivers. We know Ohio State has cranked out NFL talent after NFL talent the last couple of years, and he never faced Ohio State because of COVID. The last time Illinois played Ohio State was like 2017. And so I wonder if Witherspoon is as an elite a man coverage guy as at least his PFF grades seem to suggest. And I wonder, once we get a jumping competition from him, with some of the receivers that he's going to face in the NFL, is he going to struggle a little bit more there than he did in college? Right. And it's not to say that I think he'll be a bad NFL corner or he can't match up in man coverage. I just don't know if he's going to be as good enough to be the sort of number 1 wide receiver eraser that you're assuming he's going to be if you take a corner in the top 10. And that's kind of what it boils down to, where whether it's fair or unfair, if you're taking a corner in the top 10, the expectations are really high for that guy. That's a guy that you expect to be Jalen Ramsey. You expect that guy to be Patrick Peterson or Joe Hayden or Patrick Surtain or Stephon Gilmore or Denzel Ward. Those are the expectations. These are going to be high-end top, 5, top 10 types of corners. And when I watch Witherspoon on film, I see a good corner. I see a legitimate mid first round talent, right? A top 20 pick or something like that. But I don't see a guy that I feel like, yep, put him on Stephon Diggs. He's going to lock him up. Put him on Michael Thomas. He's going to lock that guy up. Put him on DeAndre Hopkins or, Justin Jefferson, and he's locking that guy down. Right. And again, that's a tall order for any cornerback in the NFL, but I think it would be an especially tall order for a guy like Devon Witherspoon. And so this is why teams tend to target height, weight, speed earlier in the draft, because they're like, we're looking for those types of guys that have the athletic profile to be able to go toe to toe with the elite receivers in the NFL. And I don't know if that's Witherspoon, but I do like him as a player. As I said, I do think he's a legit mid first round talent. I do think he'll be an effective man coverage corner in the NFL. But I also think he'll be a really high level zone coverage guy, especially given his mentality that he's just going to be roaming around the football field looking for people to hit and make plays on the ball. And I recently saw Jordan Reed of ESPN in his 7-round mock draft mock Devon Witherspoon number 14 overall to the Patriots. And like, to me, I was like, oh, that's a perfect fit for him. That's the ideal scenario for him. And so if he is going to wind up proving me wrong and turn into a superstar of a player, like him going to New England to me makes a ton of sense. I'm like, okay, that's the one place where he will actually live up to the billing of where he's being drafted as that guy. So we'll see how that goes. To me, it makes a little bit more sense if the Falcons were to trade back to pick up Devon Witherspoon a little bit later in the draft. But if they're going to stick at 8, I'd be very skeptical that Witherspoon is going to be their guy. Frankly, I'd be pretty skeptical that any cornerback will be their guy at 8, given some factors and variables. And we'll break down exactly what those factors and variables are as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about the Locked On Braves podcast. Of course, baseball is back. And so make sure you check out your favorite illustrious baseball podcast on your most illustrious baseball team by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So wrapping up today's episode, let's talk a little bit why I'm probably a little more skeptical than others are that the Falcons are going to use that number 1 pick at the 8th overall selection on the corner. And to me, it makes sense why people expect the Falcons to make a corner. And I'm not going to say they won't do it. I think the board has to fall a certain way for it to happen. But I think the reason why it makes sense for the Falcons to take a corner back at 8 is a reason I've heard a lot of Falcon fans kind of not necessarily say it exactly like this, but the general idea is, what's better than having one AJ Terrell? Why not having 2? And I think that makes perfect sense from a logical standpoint. But I think part of the issue that's holding me back on that is, while having 2 high-level man cover corners, if you want to call AJ Terrell that, and whoever you envision to be that other guy, whether that's Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon or Devon Witherspoon out of Illinois or somebody else, Joey Porter Jr. at Penn State, consistently the top 3 cornerbacks on sort of in consensus rankings. I think the thing that holds you back is from having those 2 high-level guys is injuries. And you go back to I know Dean Pease talked about this back in 2021 in one of his press conferences, which is that if one of those, if your scheme, your defensive scheme is predicated on having 2 high-level man coverage corners, and one of those guys gets hurt, whether it's for a season or a couple of games, you have to change completely how you play defense. And this is something that the Falcons experienced back in 2021 when AJ Terrell missed some time at various points in that season due to concussions. They changed how they play defense. They went from one zone coverage to another zone coverage based off of their backups, right? You saw this in 2018 and 2019 with the Falcons under Dan Quinn, where they were a team that, featured a lot of man coverage in those years, but with Robert Alford missing time in 18 and Trufant missing time in 19, they had to kind of dial back their man coverage whenever those guys were out of the lineup because their backups are not as capable of playing at a high level man coverage corner. And another factor that sort of is rattling around in my brain that I think may influence the Falcons' decision to take a cornerback high in this draft is something that Josh Kendall of The Athletic said on this podcast when he was on here at the beginning of free agency a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Chris Lindstrom getting his extension. And I asked Josh about, is AJ Terrell next? in terms of the next internal guy to get that big money. And Josh was kind of like pumping the brakes on that. Like, we're not there yet. Right. And based off of that, if the Falcons are not necessarily all in on AJ Terrell being here long term, it would make sense for the Falcons to want to target a cornerback at the top of this year's draft to get their guy that will be here long term. And certainly, to me, when we talk about a cornerback that looks the part of a typical top 10 corner, someone like Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon, could be that guy that could live up to the expectations that you're hoping for a top 10 corner. But, in the week since, Terry Fontenot has gone on record saying that we love AJ and whatnot. And, you can't read too much into anything Terry Fontenot says about who the Falcons love and and what their plans are. But, we got a caveat that it wasn't as if Josh was saying, hey, they're not going to pay AJ Terrell. It's just saying that they weren't there yet at that point in that process. And, if you assume that, they aren't there yet and they're never going to get there, or they're at least skeptical that internally the team is skeptical that they will get there with AJ Terrell, that would certainly push them in the direction of getting a corner at 8. But if they aren't there, but they feel confident they will get there, within the next 12 months in terms of paying AJ Terrell a big chunk of money, then I think it actually pushes them in the opposite direction and pushes them away from taking corner at 8, because, typically teams don't pay 2 corners. If you're going to give out a monster contract to one cornerback in the next calendar year, you don't necessarily feel as compelled to, use premium resources. And I know it's a rookie contract, so it's not as if you're going out there and dropping $20 million on a free agent or anything like that. So that does need to be factored in. But you are potentially putting yourself in a position that 3 years down the road, you have to pay that other guy that you just drafted, in this case, Gonzalez or Witherspoon as well. And I don't know if the Falcons necessarily want to jump headlong into that. Now, drafting players based off of, whether or not you're going to pay them second contracts probably is a little overrated at a certain point, but it is a factor in the decision making. And it just goes back to a point I made earlier. Like, typically you don't see teams, using premium resources on 2 corners, right? The Ravens and Dolphins are 2 teams that have, the last couple of years paid a lot of money to have 2 high-level corners. And again, going back to the earlier point about injuries being a factor, both of those teams have suffered that, where their defense has suffered because, Byron Jones missed all of this past year with the Dolphins, and Marcus Peters missed all of the previous year with the Ravens. And it led to people getting fired. Defensive coordinators got fired over that, right? Literally, Wink Martindale got fired in Baltimore, and Josh Byers, I believe, was the Dolphins DC that got fired this past year, because all of a sudden they were put all their chips onto playing a certain style of defense, and someone got hurt and they couldn't play that style of defense and they weren't able to adjust. And I think there are lessons there, right? And then you also kind of look around the league. There is the only team that has 2 first-round picks starting for them at corner that they drafted, right? There are multiple teams that have former first-round picks that they didn't necessarily draft, but 2 guys they drafted was Green Bay, right? With Jair Alexander and Eric Stokes. And, Green Bay's secondary wasn't great last year. I know most of that is seemingly more on the safety play than necessarily the cornerback play, but it is, to me, again, I think it's notable that, having 2 AJ Terrells in what we're talking about may not be as beneficial as I think we would automatically assume it would be. Again, that logic of what's better than 1 AJ Terrell, 2 AJ Terrells. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't invest resources at the cornerback if you have an AJ Terrell type of player, if you have a Jair Alexander. Like, that's a mistake to use a first round pick or to pay money for your number 2 corner. But it does make me think that teams, generally speaking, and again, this goes back to the assumption I'm making about the Falcons being a typical NFL team when it comes to this, and maybe they are not that type of team and operate that way. But typically teams are looking for value here. And when we use that term value, we're talking about getting good players on, say, day 2 of the draft. And so for me, at least, when I look at Witherspoon, I look at a player that I kind of consider to be a little bit of a reach at 8. Again, if the Falcons were to move back 5 spots and take Witherspoon, ahead of the Patriots or something like that, then we wouldn't be talking about him being a reach. And, to a lot of folks, and myself included, sometimes we probably overblow what's the difference between 8 and 14 or whatever in the draft. Is it really that much of a difference if the player turns out to be good? And the answer is no, it doesn't really matter where you drafted a player if the player is good. But there are bets that drafting is basically you're making bets, and there are bets that teams are much more willing to make at 8 versus bets at 14 and 24 and 42, etc. So I do wonder about the Falcons taking a player like Devon Witherspoon at 8, and I think you can probably get a lesser version of him and probably not a massive drop off based off of where that player is going to get drafted, which is Cam Smith, the South Carolina corner, similar kind of competitive guy that plays with a certain level of competitiveness and swagger that is not common. It's I won't say it's like it's not uncommon, but like they stand out to me when I watch the film. Like, okay, they play with a certain competitiveness that is not common in this draft class. And so if you can get Cam Smith, who's let's say is 90 to 95% of what Devon Witherspoon is on day 2, that's what we're talking about, where you can find value at that position, where it's like, oh, we can get basically the same player for much cheaper, and use that first round pick at another position of need, such as a pass rusher. And so that's part of what I'm kind of wondering. What attracts you to Devon Witherspoon at 8 probably also attracts you to Cam Smith at potentially 44. Now, whether Cam Smith is going to be there, who knows at this point in time. But I think the Falcons will have options beyond round 1 to upgrade their cornerback position, not to mention, the presence of Casey Hayward on the team. And we know, or we suspect, that the Falcons don't like using first round picks on players that are not going to play, right? That I think that was a factor in why they did not take a corner in 2021, even if they had liked the guy. And they're much more willing to take a quote unquote redshirt guy on day 2, as we've seen with guys like Richie Grant and Troy Anderson and Arnold Ebiketie. And again, they weren't redshirting, but it was like, we're not rushing them out on the field. The first round picks, based off of 2 years of precedent, those guys are going to play right away. And you wonder, with Casey Hayward on the roster, would a first round corner play? Now, people have said to me, like, well, couldn't you move Casey Hayward to the slot where he once upon a time played? It's been 8 years since Casey Hayward played the slot. So I don't know if that's a good strategy. It's also possible that you could take a corner and cut Casey Hayward after the draft. They cut Mike Davis last year after they drafted Tyler Algier. So it's not unheard of for the Falcons to basically say, like, okay, we got our corner at 8, presumably Christian Gonzalez, more so than Devon Witherspoon, and let's move on from Casey Hayward. That is also a possibility. But it seems like, to me, if the draft goes the way that I think the Falcons want, they would much rather use a pass rusher at 8 and then take that corner a little bit later in the draft and stash that guy to basically be the red shirt behind Casey Hayward a little bit later in the draft. So, and for those of you that may have not been listening to the last couple of episodes here on the podcast, for me, at least, in terms of what I think the Falcons are likely to do, and again, this is, at the beginning of April, and this is all subject to change by the end of April when the draft actually happens. But I think the 3 most likely bets for the Falcons in this order, in terms of if they're on the board, I think the Falcons would most likely go, would be 1, Jalen Carter at Georgia, although Josh Kendall says no, so we'll see. Then 2 would be Tyree Wilson out of Texas Tech. 3, I do think Christian Gonzalez, if he's there for Oregon, would make sense for the Falcons, given that he is a legit top 10 talent when it comes to the cornerback position. And then after that point, if those guys are all gone, I think Miles Murphy, the Clemson pass rusher, becomes a 4th on that list. Bijan Robinson, the running back from Texas, becomes 5th on that list. And Devon Witherspoon, along with several other players, would be somewhere between 6 and 10 on that list of potential options for the Falcons at 8. I'm also assuming that Will Anderson will not be there at Alabama, so he might be number 1 on that list if that's a possibility. But I'm ruling that out as a possibility at this point in time. But one potential option for the Falcons that I did not mention is Nolan Smith, the Georgia pass rusher, and he'll probably be the person that we talk about on next week's Mock Draft Monday. It's just an excuse for me to talk about the potential Falcons option. So he's on deck for us next week. So we'll see what happens with Witherspoon later this week at his private workout. And basically, do we have to, say, hey, was prophetic here on the pod because he didn't test quite as well to merit a top 10 selection, or will I have to basically just throw out this entire episode? So wouldn't be the first time. I've had episodes where like, yeah, ignore that entire thing. So we'll see what happens on Wednesday, and probably report back to you on Thursday or Friday on that subject. But that's going to do it for us here, guys, on today's episode. Again, I think cornerback is a certainly possibility, but if all things being equal, I think the Falcons, in my opinion, would prefer a pass rusher there and wait on a corner till later in the draft. And we'll see if that prediction winds up being true, and we'll see what's next for us here on Locked On Falcons. We're going to have a lot of guests in the coming days and weeks to come on and share their insights into this draft class in terms of, as well as what the Falcons should be looking for or could be looking for in this draft. So make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And for your second listen, of course, got to check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the Draft Dudes, where Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino are breaking down everything it takes to build a successful NFL franchise every single day. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.